I'd always thought of my life with Clara as a quiet masterpiece. Nothing grand or ostentatious, just a steady rhythm of shared mornings, coffee brewing in the dim light, her laughter cutting through the haze of my tired thoughts. 20 years we'd been together, married for 18, and I'd built my world around her. She was a nurse, I was a carpenter, simple folks in a small town where everyone knew your business but pretended they didn't. Our house sat on the edge of a pine forest, a creaky old thing I'd fixed up over the years, and it felt like us. Worn, warm, reliable. But then, about 6 months ago, I noticed the shift. It wasn't loud or obvious. No lipstick on collars or late-night excuses. It was subtler, like the way a river carves stone over time. She started humming tunes I didn't recognize, her fingers tapping the counter in patterns that felt foreign. She'd linger in the bathroom longer, her phone clutched tight, and when I'd ask what she was up to, she'd smile. Too wide, too quick, and say, "Just reading Tom." I'd nod because I trusted her. I'd always trusted her. The first real clue came on a Tuesday. I'd come home early from a job, my hands still dusted with sawdust, and found her in the backyard, pacing near the shed. She didn't see me at first, her voice low and urgent into the phone. "No, not yet," she said, then paused, glancing around like a deer hearing a twig snap. When she spotted me, she froze, then laughed. A brittle, hollow sound. "Just a patient's family," she said, slipping the phone into her pocket. I wanted to believe her, but her eyes darted away, and something cold settled in my chest. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay there, listening to her breathing, steady and soft, and wondered when it had started feeling like a stranger's rhythm. I didn't confront her, not then. I told myself I was imagining things, that 20 years couldn't unravel over a phone call. But the seed was planted and it grew roots fast. I started watching her more, not out of suspicion at first, but curiosity. The way she'd linger over her coffee, staring out the window with a smile I didn't understand. The way she'd leave the room to take calls, her voice muffled behind closed doors. I'd built our life with my hands, plank by plank, and now it felt like someone else was prying it apart. By the end of that month, I knew something was wrong. She'd started wearing perfume again. Not the floral stuff I'd bought her years ago, but something sharp and citrusy, like she was trying to be someone new. She'd brush her hair differently, letting it fall loose instead of the tight bun she'd worn for years. I'd catch her texting in the middle of the night, her face lit by the glow, and when I'd roll over, she'd tuck the phone under her pillow like it was a secret she couldn't share. I didn't ask who it was. I didn't want to hear the lie. It was the little things that hurt most. How she stopped asking about my day, how her hand didn't find mine anymore when we sat on the couch. I'd spent 2 decades loving her, and now I was a ghost in my own home. I started keeping a notebook, jotting down the moments that didn't add up, the late shifts that stretched too long, the new earrings I hadn't given her, the way she'd hum that damn tune. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, but I knew I'd find it. And when I did, it would change everything. The truth didn't hit me all at once. It crept in, piece by piece, like termites chewing through the beams of our life. I'd started paying attention to the details I'd ignored before, and they piled up fast. One night, Clara left her phone on the kitchen counter while she showered. A rare slip. I didn't mean to snoop, not really, but my thumb brushed the screen, and it lit up. A message preview from Dr. M. stared back at me. "Missed you today. Tomorrow?" My stomach twisted, but I didn't unlock it. Couldn't. Not yet. Dr. M. I knew who that was. Mark Hensley, the orthopedic surgeon at the hospital where Clara worked. Mid-40s, charming in that polished way I never was, with a smile that made people trust him. I'd met him once at a staff picnic, his handshake firm, his laugh loud. Clara had called him brilliant, then her eyes bright. I hadn't thought much of it. Hospitals are full of egos, and she'd always been professional. But now that name burned in my mind. I started watching her closer after that. She'd come home later some nights, her scrubs wrinkled in a way they never used to be, her cheeks flushed like she'd been running. She'd talk about work, vague stories about patients or paperwork, but Mark's name slipped in more often. "Mark said the funniest thing today," she'd say, or, "Mark's trying this new technique." I'd nod, my jaw tight, and wonder why she didn't notice how quiet I'd gotten. Then came the photo. I found it by accident, tucked in the glove box of her car when I went to grab the registration for an oil change. It was a Polaroid. Clara and Mark, standing close, her head tilted toward him, his arm brushing hers. They were outside somewhere, trees in the background, her hair loose and wild. She was smiling in a way I hadn't seen in years. Not for me. On the back, in her handwriting, M&T, August. My initials are T, sure, but I hadn't been with her in August, not like that. I stood there, the paper trembling in my hand, and felt the world tilt. I didn't confront her that day. I put the photo back, drove her car home, and sat in the garage for an hour, staring at the wall. My mind raced, piecing it together, the late nights, the perfume, the humming. It wasn't just a fling. It was something deeper, something that had rewritten her. I thought about Mark, his clean hands, his easy confidence, and hated how small I felt next to him. I'd built furniture with my hands, solid things that lasted, but he'd built something with her I couldn't touch. The next week, I followed her. I'd never done anything like that before. Felt like a fool trailing her in my truck, keeping my distance. She drove to a diner on the edge of town, one we'd never gone to together. I parked across the street and watched her walk in, her steps light, almost eager. Mark was already there, waiting at a booth by the window. She slid in across from him, and they leaned close, talking fast, laughing. Her hand brushed his once, then again, and I saw it. The spark I'd lost with her, alive in that moment with him. I drove home shaking, my knuckles white on the wheel. That night, she came back humming, her lies about extra charting smooth as ever. I didn't call her out. I couldn't. Not until I understood how far it went, how much she'd given him. But I started planning. I'd spent years building, fixing, making things whole. Now I'd tear something down. I just didn't know how yet. The days after the diner felt like walking through fog. Everything familiar but distorted, out of reach. I went through my routines, sanding wood in the shop, drinking coffee at dawn, but my mind was elsewhere, replaying that scene. Clara's hand on his, her laugh echoing in a space I didn't belong. Couldn't shake it, couldn't unsee it. And the more I thought, the more I noticed. The threads of our life unraveling, one by one. She'd started leaving hints everywhere. Careless now, like she didn't think I'd look. A receipt in her purse from a jewelry store I didn't recognize. $200 for a bracelet I'd never seen her wear. A new jacket in her closet, leather, expensive, not her style or mine. I'd find her staring out the window some mornings, lost in thought. And when I'd ask what was on her mind, she'd blink, smile, and say, "Just tired." But her eyes told a different story. Bright, alive, somewhere I couldn't follow. I dug deeper. I wasn't proud of it, but I had to know. One night, while she slept, I took her phone from the nightstand. She'd changed her password. Used to be our anniversary, now it wasn't. I tried a few guesses, then gave up. But the next day I found her laptop open on the kitchen table. She'd logged into her email, and there it was, dozens of messages from M. Hensley. I didn't read them all, couldn't stomach it, but I skimmed enough. "Can't wait to see you," one said. "You make everything better," another. The oldest was from July, 9 months ago. 9 months she'd been living this other life. The betrayal wasn't just in the words, it was in the details. She'd told him things she'd stopped telling me. How she hated the hospital's new schedule. How she dreamed of moving somewhere warm. There were photos too. Selfies of them at a lake. Her in a sundress I didn't recognize, him grinning like he'd won something. I'd built her a porch swing last summer, sanded it smooth, painted it blue because she'd asked. She'd barely sat in it since. Now I knew why. She was out there with him. I started losing sleep, my mind churning. I'd lie awake, listening to her breathe, wondering how she could sleep so easy next to me while I drowned in this. I thought about confronting her, smashing the truth in her face, but I held back. I wanted more, needed to understand the shape of it, the weight. So I kept quiet, kept watching. She didn't notice how I'd stopped talking, how my hands clenched when she mentioned his name. She was too wrapped up in her secret to see me falling apart. Then came the night that broke me open. She said she had a late shift, kissed my cheek, and left. I followed her again, my truck rumbling through the dark. She didn't go to the hospital. She drove to a cabin an hour out of town, one I'd never seen. Mark's car was there, lights glowing inside. I parked down the road, crept closer, and saw them through the window. Sitting by a fire, her head on his shoulder, his hand tracing her arm. It wasn't wild or frantic. It was tender, familiar, like they'd done it 100 times. That's what gutted me. Not the act, but the ease of it. I stumbled back to my truck, my breath ragged, and sat there until the cold seeped into my bones. I didn't cry, I was too hollow for that. But something shifted inside me, something sharp and unyielding. I'd loved her with everything I had, and she traded me for this. A smug doctor in a cabin, a life I didn't fit into. I drove home, the road blurring, and knew I couldn't let it stand. She'd taken my trust, my years, my peace. I'd take something back. The next morning, I woke up before her, made coffee like always, and sat at the table, watching her shuffle in. She yawned, smiled, said something about a tough night at work. I nodded, my face calm, my hands steady around the mug. Inside, I was a storm, rage and hurt twisting together, but I didn't let it show. I'd decided something in the dark hours after the cabin. I wouldn't confront her yet. Not until I had a plan, not until I could make her feel what I felt. I'd wear the mask of the oblivious husband a little longer. She didn't suspect a thing. That's what struck me hardest. How easy it was to fool her now that I knew the truth. I'd spent years reading her moods, knowing when she was tired or happy or hiding a headache. But she'd stopped seeing me that way. I was furniture to her now, a fixture she didn't need to study. So I played the part, asked about her day, fixed the leaky faucet she'd mentioned, even offered to cook dinner. She'd pat my arm, say, "You're sweet, Tom." And I'd smile back, my teeth gritted behind it. I started gathering more. Not just evidence, though I kept that too, snapping photos of receipts, noting her late shifts in my notebook, but pieces of her new life. I drove by the cabin again in daylight, found it was rented under Mark's name through a local agency. I saw his car at the hospital, a sleek BMW that screamed money, and wondered how long he'd been planning this, how long he'd wanted her. I even searched his name online, articles about his surgeries, a profile on the hospital site, a few blurry photos from a charity gala. He looked smug, untouchable. I hated him more every day. Clara kept up her routine, oblivious. She'd hum that tune, leave for work, come back with stories I didn't believe. I'd listen, nod, ask questions just to see how she'd spin it. "Busy night," I'd say, and she'd launch into some tale about a patient with a broken leg. Her words too polished, too rehearsed. I'd stare at her, wondering how she could lie so smooth, how she didn't see the cracks in me widening. I started testing her, subtle at first. I'd mention Mark casually, heard that doctor's doing some big procedure next week, and watch her reaction. She'd pause, just a beat, then say, "Oh yeah, he's always busy," her voice too light. Once, I left my notebook out, opened to a page with his name circled. She glanced at it, frowned, but didn't ask. I wanted her to squirm, to wonder, but she didn't. She was too sure of herself, too sure of me. The mask was heavy, though. Some nights, I'd sit in my workshop, the smell of wood and varnish thick, and feel it slip. I'd sand a board too hard, splinter it, curse under my breath. I'd think of her with him, his hands where mine used to be, her voice soft for him, and want to smash something. But I didn't. I channeled it, let it simmer, let it sharpen. I wasn't ready to break yet. I needed a plan. Something that wasn't just anger, something that would last. By the end of that week, I knew I couldn't keep trailing her. It was too risky, too raw. But I had enough, the photo, the emails, the cabin. I had the shape of her betrayal, and it wasn't standard, not some cheap fling. It was a whole life she'd built with him, a quiet, deliberate thing that mocked everything I'd given her. I'd make her pay for that. Not with shouting or fists, I wasn't that man, but with something colder, something she'd never see coming. The idea came to me slow, like a shadow stretching across the floor. I'd been sitting in my truck one evening, parked near the hospital, watching her car pull out toward the cabin again. I didn't follow this time, didn't need to. I knew where she was going, who she'd be with. Instead, I sat there, the engine off, the cold creeping in, and let my mind turn. Anger had kept me awake for weeks, but now it was hardening into something else. Something precise, something I could wield. I didn't want to just expose her. That was too simple, too quick. She'd cry, he'd apologize, and they'd either slink off together or apart, and I'd be left with nothing but the wreckage. No, I wanted her to feel it, really feel it, the way I did every time I saw that photo, every time I heard her hum. I wanted Mark to lose something too, something he valued more than her. And I wanted it to be slow, deliberate, a revenge that unfolded like a story she couldn't escape. I started small, gathering what I'd need. I knew people, quiet folks from my trade, guys who'd worked under the table, who knew how to find things others couldn't. One of them, Eddie, owed me a favor from years back when I'd built his kid's crib for free. He was a scrappy guy, good with tech, better with secrets. I met him at a bar outside town, bought him a beer and laid it out. Not the whole story, just enough. Need some dirt on a doctor, I said. Mark Hensley. Discreet. Eddie grinned, tapped his glass. Give me a week. While I waited, I kept the mask on at home. Clara was bolder now, staying out later, barely hiding her excuses. She'd come back flushed, her hair mussed, and I'd ask, "Good night." She'd nod, distracted, and I'd smile, my mind already elsewhere. I stopped cooking for her, let the house grow quiet, let her feel the distance without knowing why. She didn't notice or didn't care. That stung, but it fueled me too. Eddie came through faster than I'd expected. We met again, same bar, and he slid a folder across the table. "Your guy's not clean," he said, voice low. Inside were records, hospital complaints hushed up, a malpractice suit settled out of court, whispers of him overprescribing for cash. Nothing public, nothing concrete, but enough to work with. "He's got a reputation to protect," Eddie added. "And a wife." That last bit hit me hard. Mark was married too. Some woman named Laura, no kids, living an hour away. Clara hadn't mentioned that. Maybe she didn't know. I took the folder home, hid it in my workshop, and spent the night thinking. Mark's career was his pride, those articles online, his smug face at galas. Clara's betrayal was personal, but his was calculated. A man who thought he could take what he wanted and keep his perfect life intact. I'd start there. I'd unravel him first, let her watch it happen, let her see what she'd tied herself to. Then I'd turn it on her. The next day I made a call, not to Eddie, but to a guy I knew from high school, Pete, who worked maintenance at the hospital. "Need a favor," I said. "Access to some files, maybe a camera or two." Pete didn't ask why, just said he'd see what he could do. I wasn't sure yet how it'd all fit, but the pieces were coming together. I'd use Mark's secrets, his arrogance, and Clara's blind trust. I'd build something they couldn't tear down, something that'd leave them both broken. Not with my hands, but with my mind. That night, Clara came home late again, humming. I looked at her, really looked, and saw the stranger she'd become. I didn't hate her, not yet, but I didn't love her anymore either. I was past that, into something colder, something that felt like justice. The seed was planted. Now I'd let it grow. The plan started small, deliberate, like carving a notch into wood before the real work begins. I decided Mark would feel it first, his pride, his perfect little world. He thought he could take Clara and keep everything else intact. His career, his reputation, his wife. I'd show him how wrong he was. Pete came through a few days later, meeting me in the hospital parking lot after his shift. He handed me a thumb drive, his hands greasy from the day's work. "Security footage," he said. 2 weeks' worth. Back entrance near the ortho wing. Don't ask how I got it. I didn't. I took it home, plugged it into my old laptop in the workshop and watched. Grainy black and white clips of nurses, doctors, janitors moving through the halls. Then I saw them, Clara and Mark, late at night, slipping out together. Her hand brushed his back. His head dipped toward her as they laughed. They thought they were invisible, but here they were, caught in pixels. It wasn't enough to ruin him, not yet, but it was a start. I saved the clips, labeled them, tucked them away with Eddie's folder. Next, I turned to Laura, Mark's wife. I found her online easy enough, Laura Hensley, a real estate agent with a bright smile and a LinkedIn full of polished posts. She didn't know about Clara, I was sure of it. Mark was too careful, too smug to let his home life crack. I printed out a still from the footage, Clara and Mark, close, unmistakable, and wrote a note in block letters. Ask him where he goes after work. No signature, no return address. I mailed it from a post office 2 towns over, my hand steady as I dropped it in the slot. The first cut was made. Clara didn't notice me pulling away. She'd come home, hum her tune, and I'd sit there silent, watching her move through our house like it was still hers. I stopped asking questions, stopped pretending. She'd glance at me sometimes, her brow furrowing, but she never pressed. Maybe she thought I was tired, or maybe she didn't care. Either way, it gave me space to work. I spent nights in the workshop, piecing it together. Mark's secrets, Laura's ignorance, Clara's betrayal. It was a puzzle, and I was good at building things. A week later, I saw the ripple. I'd driven by the hospital, just to watch, and spotted Mark in the parking lot, arguing on his phone. His face was tight, his gestures sharp. Nothing like the smooth charm I'd seen before. Laura must have gotten the note, must have asked. I didn't smile, didn't feel triumph. Not yet. It was just the beginning. A crack in his facade. I wanted more. I wanted him to squirm, to look over his shoulder, to wonder who knew. That night, Clara came home late again, her eyes distracted. "Rough day," she said, dropping her bag on the counter. I nodded, poured her a glass of water, and asked, casual as ever, "Mark doing okay? Heard he's been busy." She froze, just for a second, then smiled. "Yeah, he's fine." "Why?" I shrugged. "Just heard some talk." Her lips twitched, but she didn't push. I let it hang there, a tiny seed of doubt. She didn't know I'd mailed the note, didn't know I was watching her world tilt. But she'd feel it soon. I lay awake that night, the plan growing clearer. Mark's career was next, those hushed-up complaints Eddie found, the overprescribing. I'd dig deeper, find proof, make it public. Laura would crack him open at home. I'd do it at work. And Clara? She'd watch it all collapse, tethered to a man who'd lose everything. I'd make sure she felt the weight of it, the cost of what she'd chosen. The first cut was clean. The next would be deeper. Mark started unraveling faster than I'd expected. I'd see him at the hospital when I drove by. His BMW parked crooked. His shoulders hunched as he talked on the phone. Once, I caught him pacing outside, his voice raised, then cutting off sharp as he noticed me idling across the street. I waved, slow and deliberate, and he stared back, his jaw tight. He knew something was off, but he didn't know how much. Not yet. Laura was working for me now, whether she knew it or not. Eddie had a buddy who could tap into things, nothing fancy, just public records and a little social engineering. He got me her phone number, and I made an anonymous call one night from a burner I'd bought at a gas station. "Check his accounts," I said, my voice low, then hung up. 2 days later, Eddie told me she'd hired a PI, some guy sniffing around Mark's finances. I didn't care about the money, but I knew she'd find more than that. She'd find Clara. I turned back to the hospital. Pete got me more patient logs this time, slipped to me in a manila envelope. I cross-checked them with Eddie's dirt and found patterns. Mark signing off on pain meds for patients who didn't need them, dates matching cash deposits in his name. Sloppy, arrogant work, he thought no one would look. I started drafting a letter, anonymous, to the state medical board. I didn't send it yet, just wrote it, rewrote it, made it sharp. I wanted it ready when the time came. Clara felt the shift too, though she didn't say it. She'd come home quieter now, her humming softer, her eyes darting to me more often. "You okay, Tom?" she asked one night, her voice tentative. I looked at her, really looked, and saw the stranger she'd become, her hair loose, that citrus scent clinging to her. "Fine," I said, my tone flat. She nodded, but I saw the flicker, worry, maybe guilt. "Good. Let her wonder." I kept feeding the web. I mailed another note to Laura, this time with a date and time. Cabin on Route 17, Friday night. I'd seen them there again. Couldn't stop myself from checking. I wanted her to catch them, to see it raw. I pictured her driving up, her perfect life shattering as she watched her husband with my wife. I didn't need to be there. I'd know when it hit. Mark would crack, and Clara would feel the fallout. The next day I called Eddie again. "Need one more thing," I said. "Hospital security logs, who's been in his office." He grumbled but agreed. I wanted every angle covered, every move tracked. Mark thought he was untouchable, but I was closing in. I'd built things my whole life, tables, chairs, homes. Now I was building a trap, and it felt right, like sanding a joint until it locked tight. That Friday I stayed home, waiting. Clara left early, said she had a meeting. I didn't follow, I knew where she'd be. I sat in the dark, the house silent, and pictured it. Laura pulling up to the cabin, her headlights catching them, the shouting, the tears. I didn't feel joy, didn't feel much at all. Just a cold satisfaction, like finishing a project. The web was tightening, and they didn't even know I'd spun it. It happened faster than I'd planned. Saturday morning, Clara came home late, her face pale, her hands trembling as she set her keys down. "Bad night," she muttered, avoiding my eyes. I didn't ask. Didn't need to. I'd driven by the cabin at dawn, seen the tire tracks, the muddy mess where 2 cars had peeled out. Laura had been there, I was sure of it. The storm had broken, and Clara was caught in it. She didn't talk much that day, just moved through the house like a ghost, her phone silent for once. I watched her, my mask still on, and wondered what she'd seen. Mark's excuses, Laura's rage. I didn't care about the details. I cared about the damage. She made coffee, spilled it, cursed under her breath. I cleaned it up, silent, letting her stew. She didn't notice how calm I was, how steady my hands stayed. By Monday, the hospital was buzzing. Pete called me that night, his voice low. "Big mess here," he said. "Hensley's on leave, something about an investigation. People are talking." I thanked him, hung up, and sat back in my workshop chair. The medical board letter was still on my desk, unsent. I hadn't needed it. Laura's PI must have dug up enough, or maybe the security footage had leaked. Either way, Mark was sinking, and I'd barely lifted a finger. Clara felt it too. She came home that night, her eyes red, her scrubs wrinkled. "Mark's in trouble," she said, her voice small. "Some mix-up with records." I nodded, stirred my soup, and said, "That's a shame." She stared at me, searching, but I gave her nothing. She didn't know I'd started it, didn't know I'd mailed the notes, fed the fire. But she was shaken, and that was enough for now. I kept pushing. Eddie's guy got me the security logs. Mark's office had been accessed late one night, not by him. Someone else was digging, maybe Laura's PI, maybe hospital brass. I didn't care who. It meant more pressure, more cracks. I mailed one last note to Laura, a copy of a patient log with Mark's signature circled. No explanation. Let her connect the dots. Let her bury him. That week, Clara broke. She sat me down at the kitchen table, her hands twisting together. "Tom, I need to tell you something," she said, her voice trembling. I braced myself, kept my face blank. She didn't confess, not fully. "Mark and we've been close. Too close. I didn't mean for it to happen." She stopped, waiting, tears welling up. I looked at her, the woman I'd loved, and felt nothing. Just a hollow space where she used to be. "Okay," I said, standing up. "I'll sleep in the guest room." She blinked, stunned, but I walked away. She didn't know the half of it, didn't know I'd already torn her world apart. The storm was raging now. Mark's career crumbling, Laura's wrath unleashed, Clara's lies exposed. I'd lit the match, but they'd fueled the fire. And I wasn't done. Mark's fall was public now, and I watched it unfold from the shadows. The local paper ran a story. Small, buried on page 3. But there, Local surgeon suspended amid inquiry. No details, just enough to stain him. I drove by the hospital, saw his parking spot empty. His nameplate gone from the directory. Laura must have pushed hard, or the board had moved fast. Either way, he was out, his smug grin erased. Clara was a wreck. She'd stopped humming, stopped pretending. She'd sit on the couch, staring at nothing, her phone dark. She tried talking to me again, a few days after her half-confession. "It's over with him," she said, her voice raw. "I swear, Tom, I messed up." I looked at her, saw the desperation, and nodded. "Sure," I said, my tone flat. She wanted forgiveness, but I had none to give. I'd already moved past her, past us. I kept tabs on Mark. Eddie's guy got me whispers. Laura had filed for divorce, citing infidelity and financial misconduct. The PI had found Clara's name, linked it to the cabin, the late nights. Mark was scrambling, calling lawyers, but the damage was done. His patients were gone, his reputation shredded. I pictured him alone, his BMW gathering dust, and felt a flicker of something. Not joy, but a grim satisfaction. He'd taken from me. I'd taken more from him. The house grew colder. Clara and I barely spoke. She'd cook. I'd eat in silence, then retreat to the workshop. She'd watch me sometimes, her eyes pleading, but I didn't budge. I'd built our life together, and she'd burned it down. Now she wanted me to rebuild? No, I was done fixing things for her. I started packing, slowly, quietly, my tools, my clothes, my notebooks. She didn't notice or didn't care. I met Eddie one last time, handed him a wad of cash for his trouble. "You're a ghost, man," he said, grinning. "Hensley's toast, and no one's pointing at you." I nodded, didn't smile back. It wasn't about staying hidden, it was about watching them fall. Laura had her revenge, Mark had his ruin, and Clara had her guilt. But it didn't feel like victory. It felt hollow, like a chair I'd built with no one to sit in it. That night, I sat in the workshop, the folder open, photos, logs, notes. I'd won, hadn't I? Mark was broken, Clara was alone. But I wasn't whole. I'd spent months carving this revenge, and now it was done, and I was still here, in a house that wasn't mine anymore. I burned the folder in the backyard, the flames licking up the evidence, and watched it turn to ash. Clara saw me from the window, her face pale, but she didn't come out. She knew something was ending. I wasn't finished, though. Mark and Laura were collateral, Clara was the heart of it. I'd let her think it was over, let her breathe. Then I'd twist the knife. I moved out the next week. Not far, just a rented room above a hardware store in town. Clara didn't fight it, didn't beg me to stay. She just stood in the doorway, arms crossed, and said, "If that's what you want." I didn't answer, just loaded my truck and left. The house was hers now, a shell of what we'd built. I didn't look back. I kept my ear to the ground. Mark's suspension turned permanent. License revoked. A quiet settlement with the hospital. Laura took half his assets, left him with a condo and a mountain of debt. Clara went back to work, head down, no more late nights. People talked. Small towns love a scandal, but no one tied it to me. I was the quiet carpenter, the guy who fixed their porches, not the one who'd orchestrated this. But Clara wasn't free. I'd saved the cruelest part for her, the one that'd linger. I'd found it in her emails, back when I'd skimmed them. A dream she'd shared with Mark, one she'd never told me. She wanted a little shop, a place to sell handmade jewelry, something she'd fiddled with years ago. She'd written him about it, glowing, hopeful. I'd ignored it then, but now it was my weapon. I used my savings, not much, but enough, and bought a storefront on Main Street. I fixed it up myself, sanded the floors, painted the walls, hung a sign, Clara's Craft. Then I leased it to a woman I knew, a widow named Beth who made quilts. I told her to spread the word. Tell everyone it was Clara's dream, snatched up by someone else. I didn't care about the money. I cared about the sting. Clara would see it, hear about it, know it could have been hers if she hadn't thrown me away. She did. A month later, I saw her outside the shop, staring at the sign, her face crumpling. Beth told me later Clara had come in, Asked about it, her voice shaking. She looked lost, Beth said. I nodded, said nothing. That was the point. Clara lost. Her dream twisted into someone else's triumph. She'd feel it every time she passed by, every time someone mentioned it. I settled into my new life, small, quiet, mine. Mark was a ghost, Laura was gone, and Clara was alone with her guilt. I'd built their ruin piece by piece, and now it was done. I didn't feel whole, didn't feel healed, but I felt steady. The revenge was complete, and it was cruel, and it was enough. The room above the hardware store became my new anchor, small, bare, with a single window overlooking Main Street. I'd wake early, the smell of sawdust and metal drifting up from below, and watch the town stir. Clara's shop, Beth's shop now, sat 2 blocks down, its sign bold against the morning light. I didn't go near it, didn't need to. I knew she'd see it every day, a quiet knife twisting in her side. That was the beauty of it. No shouting, no confrontation, just a wound that wouldn't heal. I heard about her through others. Small-town gossip is a living thing. Pete said she'd gone quiet at the hospital, her shifts shorter, her smile gone. Beth told me Clara stopped by the shop again, lingered outside, then left without a word. She looked like she'd seen a ghost, Beth said, her voice soft. I nodded, sipped my coffee, and let the image settle. Clara haunted by her own dreams. Fitting, after she'd haunted me with her lies. Mark faded too. Eddie's whispers confirmed it. He'd moved out of town, some cheap apartment an hour away, his career ashes. Laura had taken everything worth taking, left him with nothing but his name, now a punchline. I didn't care about him anymore. He'd been a tool, a stepping stone. Clara was the heart of it, the one I'd loved, the one who'd carved me hollow. Her punishment was my focus now, and it was working. I kept busy, taking odd jobs, fixing fences, building shelves. People didn't ask about Clara, didn't pry. They assumed I'd moved on, and I let them think it. But I hadn't, not really. I'd stopped loving her. Sure. But I couldn't stop seeing her. Couldn't stop the memories of her humming, her hand in mine. I'd burned that life down, and now I was sifting through the embers, looking for something I couldn't name. One night she called. I'd kept my old number, hadn't expected her to use it. Tom, she said, her voice thin. Can we talk? I stared at the phone, my thumb hovering, then let it go to voicemail. She didn't leave one. The silence said enough. She was reaching, grasping, and I wasn't there to catch her. I sat in the dark, the hum of the street below, and felt the weight of that choice. It wasn't mercy, it was power. I'd taken it back. The next day, I saw her car parked near the shop, her silhouette inside, head bowed. She didn't go in, just sat there, then drove off. I watched from my window, my coffee cold in my hands. She was braking, slow and steady, and I'd built the machine that did it. The sign, the whispers, the life she'd wanted. All out of reach, all because of me. It wasn't loud or violent, but it was cruel, and it was mine. I slept better that night, the first time in months. The echoes of her betrayal still lingered, but they were quieter now, drowned out by the silence I'd forced on her. She'd chosen Mark, chosen a lie, and I'd made her live with the cost. The end was close. I could feel it, but I wasn't done watching her fall. Clara's decline became a mirror, reflecting back what I'd lost, and what I'd taken. I didn't stalk her, didn't need to. The town did it for me, its voices carrying her story in fragments. A cashier at the grocery store mentioned she'd seen Clara there, buying single servings of frozen meals, her cart half empty. Pete said she'd taken a leave from the hospital. Personal reasons. Her locker cleared out. Beth told me Clara had stopped by the shop again, asked about the lease, then left when Beth said it was locked in for a year. I pictured her in our old house, hers now, alone with the creaky floors and the porch swing she never used. I'd left it behind, a relic of a life she'd abandoned. Did she sit there now, staring at the pines, wondering how it unraveled? Did she see me in the shadows, the man who'd built it all, then tore it down? I hoped she did. I hoped it gnawed at her, the way her lies had gnawed at me. I kept my routine, work, coffee, the view from my window. The shop thrived under Beth, her quilts drawing customers, the sign glowing. People talked about it. Clara's dream. They'd say, not knowing the irony, not knowing I twisted it. I'd nod when they mentioned it, my face blank, and let the story spread. It was a slow poison, seeping into her days, and I savored the thought of her hearing it, feeling it. One afternoon, I saw her on Main Street, walking alone, her coat too big, her steps slow. She paused by the shop, stared at the sign, then turned away, her shoulders hunched. I watched from across the street, my truck idling, and felt a pang. Not pity, not regret, but something sharp and fleeting. She looked small, diminished, a shadow of the woman I'd loved. I'd done that. I'd carved her down, piece by piece, and now she was here, lost in the wreckage. She didn't see me, didn't look up. I drove off, the pang fading, replaced by that cold steadiness I'd grown used to. I didn't need her tears, didn't need her to beg. I needed her to live with it, to carry the weight I'd dropped on her. The mirror showed me a man who'd lost everything, wife, home, trust, but it also showed a man who'd won, in his own way. She'd betrayed me with Mark, with a life I couldn't touch, and I'd betrayed her dream, turned it into a cage. That night, I worked late in the hardware store's back room, sanding a table for a client. The rhythm was soothing, the wood smooth under my hands. I thought of Clara, thought of the shop, thought of the silence between us. It wasn't over, not fully. She'd reach out again, or she'd break completely, and I'd be there watching, waiting. The revenge was alive, breathing, and I'd feed it until it was done. She came to me a week later, unannounced, her knock on my door sharp against the quiet evening. I opened it, saw her standing there, pale, eyes red, her hair a mess. "Tom," she said, her voice cracking, "I need to talk." I stepped aside, let her in, my face a mask. The room was sparse. Bed, chair, a lamp, and she looked out of place, a relic from a life I'd left behind. She sat, hands twisting in her lap. "I know you hate me," she started. "And I deserve it. I messed up, Tom. Mark, he's gone, it's over, but I can't." She stopped, tears spilling. I stood by the window, arms crossed, and let her flounder. "I saw the shop," she said finally, her voice small. "Beth said it was your idea. Why'd you do that?" I didn't answer, just watched her, let the question hang. She wanted me to explain, to give her something to hold on to. I wouldn't. "I wanted that," she whispered. "You knew I did, and you gave it to her." Her eyes searched mine, pleading. I shrugged, kept my tone flat. Seemed like a good spot for Beth. She flinched like I'd struck her, and I saw it, the realization sinking in. She didn't know the half of it, didn't know about the notes, the footage, the web I'd spun. But she felt this, the shop, the dream she'd lost, and it was enough. She talked more. About Mark's ruin, Laura's divorce, her own guilt. "I didn't mean to hurt you," she said, over and over, like it'd change anything. I listened, nodded, gave her nothing. She wanted absolution, a way back, but I'd closed that door months ago. "I'm sorry," she said finally, standing. "I just needed you to know." I opened the door, let her out, and watched her walk away, her steps unsteady. After she left, I sat in the dark, replaying it. She thought this was about hate, about punishment. It wasn't, not anymore. It was about balance, about taking what she'd taken from me. The shop was the final piece, the cruelest, because it wasn't loud or violent. It was personal, a theft of something she'd held close. She'd see it every day, live with it, and that was my victory. I didn't sleep much that night, but I didn't need to. The plan was done, the pieces in place. She'd come back, maybe, or she'd fade away, but either way, I'd won. The unseen visitor had left, and I was alone again, steady in the silence. The town settled into its rhythm after that, the scandal fading into background noise. Mark was gone, Laura invisible, and Clara a whisper on the edges. I kept working, kept living, small jobs, quiet nights. The shop thrived. Beth's Quilts a hit, the sign a fixture on Main Street. People stopped mentioning Clara to me, sensing the wall I'd built, and I let them think I'd moved on. I hadn't, not fully, but I didn't need to. The weight of what I'd done was enough. I saw her once more by chance at the gas station. She was pumping fuel, her coat frayed, her face thin. She didn't notice me at first, but when she did, her eyes widened, then dropped. I nodded, paid for my coffee, and left. No words, no need. She looked worn, like the years had caught up overnight, and I felt that pang again. Sharp, brief, gone. I didn't pity her, didn't hate her. She was just there, a shadow of what we'd been. Beth told me later Clara had stopped coming by the shop. She drives the long way now, Beth said. Avoids Main Street. I nodded, filed it away. The shop was doing its work, a constant reminder, a burr under her skin. I'd built it to last, to linger, and it did. I'd taken her dream, turned it into something she couldn't touch, and that was the cruelest cut. Quiet, permanent, mine. I started sketching again, something I hadn't done since before it all fell apart. Simple things, chairs, tables, a birdhouse. I'd sit by the window, pencil in hand, and let the lines take shape. It wasn't healing, not exactly, but it was steadying, a way to fill the hollow. The revenge was done, the plan complete, but I was still here carrying it. I didn't mind. It was my weight to bear, a shadow I'd cast. One night, Pete called. Heard Clara's selling the house, he said. Moving out of town, maybe? I thanked him, hung up, and stared at the wall. She was running or trying to, didn't matter. The shop would follow her. The whispers would follow her. The loss would follow her. I'd made sure of that. She could leave, but she couldn't escape what I'd built. I slept deep that night, the first time in years, the weight of shadows settling into something I could carry. She was gone or going, and I was here, whole in my own way. The story was ending, and I'd written the last word. Winter came early that year, the air sharp, the streets quiet. I stayed in my room, worked my jobs, watched the snow dust Main Street. The shop glowed through the gray, Beth's Quilts in the window, the sign steady above. Clara was gone by then, house sold, no forwarding address. Pete said she'd left in a hurry, her car packed, no goodbyes. I didn't care where she went. She'd carry it with her, and that was enough. Mark surfaced once, a blip in the paper, sued by a former patient, living somewhere cheap and far. Laura remarried, moved on. The town forgot them, mostly the scandal a faded echo. I stayed, the carpenter on the fringes, my hands busy, my mind still. People nodded to me, hired me, left me alone. I liked it that way. I finished the birdhouse one night, hung it outside my window. A chickadee moved in by spring, its chirps cutting through the dawn. I'd sit there, coffee in hand, and watch it, small, simple, alive. It wasn't much, but it was mine, something I'd built that didn't hurt. The revenge was done, the cruelty spent, and I'd found a peace in the aftermath. Not bright, not loud, but real. I thought of Clara sometimes, wondered if she'd rebuilt, if she'd found a way to live with it. I hope she hadn't, not fully. I'd taken her dream, her trust, her ease, and I wanted her to feel it, always. It wasn't hate, wasn't love, just justice, my kind, carved slow and deep. The shop stood as proof, a monument to what she'd lost, and I'd built it with my hands, my mind, my pain. The years stretched out and I kept going, work, sketches, the birdhouse. The hollow was still there, but it was smaller now, a space I'd learned to live with. I'd loved her once, lost her, broken her. Now I was free or close to it, a carpenter at peace with the wreckage. The story was mine, start to finish, and I'd ended it my way.